Unabashed.
The most unpredictable,
Becomes a headline.
the most volatile,
Outrageous behavior.
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Late last week, Russia launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, deploying the might of the Russian military to conduct a hostile takeover of its sovereign neighbor. The invasion has prompted a flurry of diplomatic activity as the world tries to find an urgent solution to the crisis. Over the past few days, India's role has received significant attention as it has neither condoned Russia's behavior nor necessarily condemned it in the strongest terms. India has a long strategic relationship with Russia that it can ill afford to rupture, especially when it has thousands of Chinese troops on its northern border. At the same time, there are increasing calls from the West for India to quote-unquote get off the fence. To discuss India-Russia relations in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, I'm joined today by Raji Rajagopalan. Dr. Rajagopalan is the director of the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology at the ORF Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. She has extensive experience, both inside and outside of government, on issues of Indian foreign policy, national security. I am pleased to welcome her to the show for the very first time. Raji, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, Milan, for having me on this show.
So I want to start with like a very amateur 30,000-foot question. And I want to preface it by saying I got an email from a friend who studies political risk around the world. And his email went something like this. He said, look, I understand Russia is a major arms supplier to India, but I really don't understand why is it that Russia-India ties run so deep? And so maybe for the uninitiated among us, we could start there. Raji, how do we think about the kind of foundations of India-Russia ties?
It's a great question to start. And I think the source of the India-Russia relationship goes to, I think, a deep strategic empathy, at least on the Indian side towards Russia, in the sense that we feel very strongly supportive of Russia. And where does that really come from? I think it's a part of it is India's post-colonial heritage. So India, right from the beginning, has had an understandable, in a sense, anti-Western sentiment, considering that we were colonized by the British. So there is that element that comes into play. In addition, there was also the whole Cold War politics, the anti-Western sentiments during the entire Cold War period. And so this, in a sense, translating to some sort of an anti-Americanism, because we were on the opposite sides during the entire Cold War, which also translated to pro-Russia feelings, in a sense. So, now, of course, Nehru was much more sympathetic to the Soviet Union. There were, of course, others, even on the Indian political right. So Russia did, or the Soviet Union did, enjoy a lot of support. India's plans of economic development on the Soviet model of 5-year plans, a lot of assistance for its steel plants and kind of things. So it built a strong support within India, in a sense. And since the 1960s, Soviet Union was also seen as supporting India consistently. And this was particularly the case during the 71 war. Which had a big impact because it was considered as India's proudest moment. So the Soviet Union was seen as helping India with multiple vetoes within the UN Security Council and so on and so forth. But even generally, the Soviet Union was seen as sympathetic to India's needs with no strings attached to its support for India, whether it is the weapons transfers or political and diplomatic support, whereas the US assistance was always perceived as there are strings attached, there are certain conditions and so on and so forth. But if you look at it, I think the history is actually a lot more complicated. The Soviet Union support has never been continuous towards India. For instance, in 1962, the war with China, in fact, the Soviet Union abandoned India during those critical weeks of the war because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they needed China on their side. They, of course, came after the war was over. Similarly, in 1965, the Tashkent Agreement, and even after the Tashkent Agreement, Soviet Union adopted a neutral attitude between India and Pakistan, supplied even Pakistan with some small weaponry and weapon systems and so on and so forth, in order to demonstrate its neutrality. Come 71, the Soviet Union was quite opposed to the war, tried very hard to prevent India from going to war. It was quite unhappy with the vetoes that it had to do within the UN Security Council and in the General Assembly. But you had Soviet Union and a few of its friendly states who stood with India. But I think it was more essentially Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's smart maneuvering of the Soviet Union that finally pushed Moscow to do what it did. Certainly, they did not support India very happily during those days. strategies. So therefore, overall, when you look at it, there is a deep well of sympathy that goes beyond just weapons. There's a deep sympathy across political and intellectual spectrum, especially the elite perceptions. If you look at the current crisis, you don't see any demonstration calling out the Russian behavior. And contrast this with the Iraq war demonstration in 2003, when Prime Minister Vajpayee brought out supporting the supporting the US in very minimal ways during that time. So that's that historical, and we are very, very historically we have been remained very supportive of Russia, and that support continues today also. And there is some hesitancy to break away from Russia completely. I think that is what is kind of holding the India-Russia relations even now to some extent.
But there's a sense in recent years, despite all of this, that not all is well in the Russia-India relationship. You had a piece for ORF, which was on the eve of Vladimir Putin's summit with Prime Minister Modi. And you noted that Putin's visit at that time, and this was in December of last year, was seen as an effort to repair the damage done to the relationship over the last couple of years, which have seen kind of India and Russia drift apart. What was the reason for damage control? What was going on behind the scenes that required things to be patched up?
Yeah, definitely over the last at least 5 years or so, India's concerns about China has brought it a lot closer to the US partners, whether it is Japan, Australia, and so on and so forth. At the same time, Russia has increasingly become closer to China. And that has basically meant that there has been some tension in the relationship, whether Russia's objection to the Quad or the concept of the Indo-Pacific. These are things that Russia has come to increasingly very strongly oppose and take very strong positions on vis-a-vis India. And Russia has been rather undiplomatic in their demonstration of their frustration of India's evolving position and strategies. So look at some of the comments, for instance, from Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and the very strong reaction, uncharacteristic strong reaction from the Ministry of External Affairs, reflects, in a sense, the difficulties that are beginning to creep in this relationship. With Russia essentially echoing China's concerns about the Quad or the evolving Indo-Pacific strategies as mechanisms to counter China, Moscow is essentially being increasingly insensitive to India's concerns. In fact, Lavrov raised his first time his objections when he was in New Delhi for the Raisina dialogue in 2020. And of course, he had made repeated assertions on the same point, saying that India has become an object of the Western countries' persistent and aggressive policies aimed at anti-China games and so on and so forth. So this has not been this has not been an easy relationship in recent times, and I would think the increasingly adversarial nature of relations with China, specifically after the Galvan conflict, India is bound to get closer to the US and US partners, whereas who also share similar threat perceptions about China and engage actively in multilaterals that are shaping up in the Indo-Pacific. And I think Russia will find it increasingly difficult to come to appreciate or understand India's geopolitical concerns and why we partner with the US and other partners. So I think there are going to be these problems are not going to go away, and I think this is the damage that I think Putin's visit was trying to do, damage correction. So on the one hand, you have the military ties still somewhat going strong, at least the arms purchases. But politically, there are increasing divergences and difficulties. But the key point is that India does not want to write off the relationship with Russia, like I said. Therefore, India has felt the need to engage in activities that could repair in some of the damages. So Putin-Modi summit happened. And earlier last year, even Lavrov was in Delhi on a similar mission. So I think there is certain recognition that we need to keep this relationship going and keep it on some sort of a balance. But I think that balance is becoming very difficult to sustain in a sense.
Let me ask you just on the defense bit, because in that same ORF note, and we'll link to that in our notes, you noted that despite the fact India has done its best to try to diversify its defense trade partners, Russia continues to maintain a dominance. I think it supplies about 70% of India's defense inventory, right? So on the one hand, we hear a lot about growing defense deals between India and the United States, countries of Europe, Israel. But despite this growth, it still seems that Russia still dominates. Is that a fair judgment in your view?
Yes, it is a fair judgment, and India is still dependent on Russia. Partly, this is a legacy issue. So, India is still buying, for instance, most recently, I think that over the last couple of years, India has agreed to buy 3 more Kilo class submarines. These are the refurbished submarines that will join the 9 other Kilo class submarines that are already with the Indian Navy. Similarly, India decided to buy an additional 400 T-90 battle tanks from Russia, joining the 1,000+ T-90s that the Indian Army already has. And if you look at the Indian tank infantry, for instance, except for the Arjun tanks, that 100+ numbers, the rest of the tank infantry are the Russian T-72s or T-90s, which is an indicator of the close historical India-Russia military relations. But so if you look at the last few years, there have been no major deals. Of course, the S-400 is a major deal, which is worth more than 5 billion. But otherwise, we are still just buying some of the old ones that we have in this within the Indian military. And so, despite the Indian efforts at reducing dependency on Russia has not been entirely successful. And this is to do with partly the legacy issue. So it's going to be difficult to cut off completely immediately. We also need spares and other supplies. But you're right, despite the efforts for more than a decade at diversifying the Indian defense trade partners, the Russian component in the Indian defense inventory is still a sizable one to the tune of 70% or thereabouts. But this is something that India has to be careful about, given the changing dynamics in the strategic ties between Russia and China and the kind of arms transactions that are taking place between Moscow and Beijing, in a sense.
Let me kind of fast forward to the current crisis where India appears to be walking a very, very narrow tightrope, right? There was a key Security Council vote last week. It abstained from condemning the Russian invasion, but India's UN ambassador publicly issued a quote unquote explanation of vote that made it clear that the Modi government was not particularly happy with Russia's behavior. Now, we all know that India is under intense international pressure to take a much harder line on the Putin regime. What do you think is the current thinking in New Delhi as we speak?
You're absolutely right. India is doing a very difficult balancing act. The Indian statement, of course, was, like I said, very critical of Russia without naming Russia. So it's very clear that India is not happy with Putin putting India on the spot. But I think there is still a lot of confusion in Delhi about how to manage this, because it's clear that India needs its new partners: the US, Japan, Australia, France, the rest of Europe. And all of India's new partners are united against Russia. But at the same time, India, like I said, cannot completely give up on Russia, especially because of the factors we discussed, like the military dependency, popular and political support, as well as the elite opinion within India, which is still sort of a pro-Russia in that regard, in that sense. So India would ideally like to have not found in this situation, or the situation just goes away, but that is not going to happen. It's just wishful thinking. So there is, of course, intense pressure on India. In fact, President Biden told the reporters that it was pressing India on its stance on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and added that the issue has not been resolved completely. And in fact, the only other country in the region, or the region, that has taken a position similar to that of India is China. And of course, you have ASEAN and the United Arab Emirates, who have taken similar positions. But none of them are major partners of India when it comes to dealing with the kind of challenges, strategic challenges that India is confronted with in the Indo-Pacific region. So India is in a bit of a pickle, but I believe it will tread that thin line. It is not likely that India will openly criticize in Russia. It'll make it clear that it's not happy with Russia's action, like the explanatory note has been very, very clear and categorical. But I think India has talked multiple times to the Ukrainian leadership, including the Ukrainian president, which I'm sure Russia is not happy about. And most recently, a few hours ago, you got the news that India is now offering humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, following a request from the Ukrainian ambassador in India following a meeting with the Indian Foreign Secretary Shringla. So in a sense, the kind of position that India is beginning to show is possibly a result of the kind of pressure that India is immensely under. because all of its new partners, like I said, are united against India, imposing economic and other penalties against Russia, whereas India has not even named Russia. So it's walking a very difficult balancing line in a sense, but I think India is certainly showing that it's not happy with the situation.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So I just want to ask you, kind of, if we look into the future, if India continues to pursue this middle ground approach, I'm wondering what the ramifications might be for the U.S.-India relationship, right? So there's some foreign affairs analysts who are warning that the Biden administration would have to contemplate CAATSA sanctions on India for its purchase of the Russian-made S-400 missile system. You have written previously about India's place in the new U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. Many people in Washington view India as the linchpin to that strategy. Do you worry that the current crisis could spiral out of control and end up having these negative spillover effects on the U.S.-India relationship?
So let me do the CAATSA bit, take the first CAATSA bit.
Sure.
I don't think the CAATSA will happen. The U.S. State Department, of course, recently said that they have not made a decision on it. And I think it's unlikely because S-400 deal happened before the CAATSA legislation came about. And the U.S. knew about the deal. Second, the CAATSA legislation came about not necessarily against India. So whether this will actually go happen or not, it's something. So the questions. The U.S. has incentives to give India a waiver, but again, it's not certain that is the way it's going to work. If the U.S. goes ahead with the CAATSA sanctions on India, it could potentially have significant negative effect on the U.S. The whole image of the U.S. as a reliable partner, those debates will kickstart, and the larger political opinion, as well as especially the elite perception of the U.S. As an unreliable partner, and so on and so forth, is going to.
It'll sort of take us back to the late 1990s and the sanctions in the wake of the nuclear tests.
Exactly. Absolutely. So from the 1970s onwards, we have had the sanctions thing hanging on this India-US relationship post 1974, then 98, and this is going to bring back all those negative perception about the US, and this is going to take back the relations. And I think that's why I kind of feel that there is, even on the Ukraine issue, I feel that there is some understanding in the US about the Indian compulsions on the Ukraine issue. And I would think that you can expect both sides to work hard to resolve that difference. In fact, even Secretary of State Tony Blinken, as well as External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, when they met in the Quad Foreign Ministerial meeting in Melbourne, they talked about, and later on they said that the relationship has matured to a level where they can discuss even some of the most difficult issues and so on and so forth. So I think there will be efforts from both sides to make sure that these differences don't become serious impediments, and some ways to resolve this difference, I think that would be found. And this could possibly involve at an unofficial level to engage further in any major defense deal with Russia in the future, or reducing its existing purchases and so on and so forth. So I don't see it as spiraling out of control, because I think both sides know that the relationship is important. Both benefit from the relationship. Washington benefits from having India in its corner as it deals with China, and India has enormous benefits too from its partnership with the United States. So China and the broader strategic concerns in the Indo-Pacific will keep both on the same side. Ukraine and Russia are, of course, unavoidable distractions, but the Indo-Pacific theater requires the two to work together. So spiraling out of control is very unlikely. Of course, both can individually balance China without coordinating, and one can say that they don't need each other. But it seems unlikely because the benefits of cooperation are far greater, and therefore it is highly unlikely that the current crisis or Russia will have a lasting impact on the US-India ties.
And I would just say, in terms of the public statements, the State Department spokesperson also put out a statement which was very balanced, saying that they understand that India basically is in a tricky situation, and we're working together on trying to address the situation. Um, Speaking of the Indo-Pacific theater, if you go back to a couple of months ago, the U.S. was harshly criticized in many quarters in India and around the world for its very messy withdrawal from Afghanistan. But the one benefit that some saw was that maybe this meant we were finally serious about shifting our gaze towards the Indo-Pacific. Now you have a major land war in Europe. How concerned are you that the West and its partners are going to take their eye off of the China ball, perhaps giving even more space to Xi Jinping to kind of expand China's quote unquote zone of influence?
There is, of course, some concerns, but I think it is not just limited to India. It's pretty widespread, including in the US, I would say. And here, I think China has been helpful because China's belligerent behavior, including use of military muscle, as well as trade and economic coercion against countries like Australia, South Korea, these have, in a sense, helped in consolidating the US as well as the broader regional, many countries, their Indo-Pacific strategy. So there is a strong strategic concerns even within the US that China is the primary problem and the US has to focus on the Indo-Pacific. Of course, there is some question about how to balance the different commitments that the US has, and that debate is ongoing in a sense. But I don't think I'm particularly concerned about the US losing its focus on the Indo-Pacific. I think before the Biden administration came into office, there was a lot of apprehension, in a sense, within the region as to how the US, the new leadership, is going to be in dealing with China and its focus on the Indo-Pacific, how it's going to play out. But I think the Russian invasion itself is definitely a problem, but in an unintended way, it may actually have helped the US. Europe, for instance, suddenly recognizes that the world is a lot more nastier a place, a lot more difficult a place, and it needs to spend more on its defense. Germany has just announced that it will spend about 2% of the GDP on its defense, providing emergency funding for boosting its military forces. And Germany traditionally has been the worst culprit in terms of how it depends, how much it spends on defense, for instance. So the Russian invasion has, at one stroke, forced the European countries to confront their security problem in a manner that I think repeated American calls and pleadings over the many decades have not really had. So, as you know, the US has been asking for several decades now to asking the NATO countries to expand their defense spending. And for 5 decades almost, you haven't, these countries have not done that despite many promises. And now suddenly NATO countries are beginning to take a better hold of their security, spending more on their security. And that could reduce the pressure on the US in Europe. And of course, we have other countries potentially joining NATO. Both Finland and Sweden joined the NATO summit a few days ago in order to coordinate their actions. So in a sense, I think Putin's actions may have actually helped the US by forcing the European countries to share a bigger burden, part of the burden in a sense. So the balance between Europe and the Indo-Pacific in terms of the US attention, of course, will remain an issue always, but I'm doubtful that the US will turn away from the Indo-Pacific in any serious manner.
Raji, I want to kind of come back to an area that we started this conversation on, which was talking about kind of Indian support for Russia. I've been surprised by how many voices in India, at least on social media, which I realize is not an accurate reflection of all reality, but how many voices appear to be, if not sympathetic to Putin, at least focusing the bulk of their ire on Ukraine, on misguided NATO expansion, on the Biden administration, other actions taken by the West. Is this, in your view, just kind of residual anti-Western sentiment, or is there something else sort of going on?
I think, like I said in the beginning, there is both the deep strategic sympathy for Russia, but also a fairly strong current of anti-Americanism. in both the left and the right of the Indian political spectrum that runs from time to time, depending on the situations. Possibly the only thing that brings both the right and the left together on the same side, in
Right.
a sense.
It's America.
Exactly. And the anti-Americanism comes, of course, as a consequence of the Cold War politics back in the 60s and 70s. The US, of course, wanted to align with India, but India's unwillingness was a serious issue at that time. And therefore, they went along with Pakistan because mainly we were non-aligned and Pakistan had no difficulty aligning with the US. Of course, this alignment was not against India, but and this was part of a larger global geopolitics. But the US was seen as aligned against India, and American position on Kashmir, not calling out Pakistan, even when Pakistan was the aggressor, the US throwing its full weight behind Pakistan during the 71 war, despite the genocide, the US sending the Task Force 74, the Enterprise mission. None of this is forgotten and none of this has helped in a sense. And of course, the U.S. nuclear non-proliferation policies, its technology export control regimes, all of them, in a sense, were targeting India. The 1998 test, the U.S. leading the sanctions thereafter. All of these are reasons for the anti-Americanism in India. But like I said, in the case of the India-Russia relations, history is, of course, a lot more complicated. But at a popular level and at an even elite level, these have not been completely understood or acknowledged, I would say. In fact, the US provided the largest economic aid to India. The US sent its Air Force during the 62 war. It did some exercises with the objective of sending a message to China. And even the 71 war, you have, of course, Nixon and Kissinger were against India, but not the rest of the administration and so on and so forth. The US coming to India as some sort of a security guarantor prior to 71, of course, not a formal one. And this changed also after 1971 when it made very clear that it will not come to India's aid if there was a war with China. And more recently, you have the U.S.-India nuclear deal, which is a major game-changer moment in the relationship. Because even though Russia and France were interested in doing nuclear commerce with India, neither Moscow nor Paris did enjoy that kind of clout or influence to change the global rules of the game. So it took the US under President Bush to alter the global rules and India's own status and its ability to engage in nuclear commerce. So the reality is that it's the US-India relations are much deeper and wider. But I think one should also take note of the fact that the anti-Americanism is primarily an elite phenomena, because if you look at the repeated opinion surveys that come about every year, they have shown that there is strong affection for the US, and therefore I would say that the anti-Americanism, those sentiments to some extent, is an elite part of the elite opinion, what you might call an IIC crowd or a Khan market crowd in a sense.
The con market gang strikes back. Just a question on India's current position, Raji. One of the arguments that you hear sometimes, and it's come out in the op-ed pages and elsewhere, is that, look, by walking this kind of fine line, middle ground approach, India risks creating a precedent that is going to be very unhelpful to it vis-a-vis China, right? Because India is certainly very concerned about Chinese action on the contested border, China occupying Indian territory, and that if they don't speak up now, the chance that others may be willing to turn a blind eye if something even more significant were to happen on India's northern border would be higher. Do you buy that idea, or do you think that most countries are able to understand the difficult diplomatic and strategic position India finds itself in right now?
So India is in a tricky place when it comes to on the one hand we have the problems with China, and the problems with China, I believe it is just usually we look at the territorial border and territorial issue as the biggest issue, but I think that's only part of the problem. And I think the main core of the problem between India and China is that China is just not willing to see that country that is also rising at the same time. And today you have the simultaneous rise of China as the most significant player, Japan returning to a more normal nation, and India rising at its own pace, even though we might be 2 or 3 generations behind that of China, and of course the return of Russia as a major Eurasian player in a sense. So you have the simultaneous rise of 3 or 4 players at the same time. You have all of these players have unresolved border and territorial sovereignty related issues. And I think this is, and of course, China does not want to see any peer competitor in its immediate neighborhood or even in the broader spectrum in a sense. So I think that's part of the problem. It does but the fact that we do have a sort of very live and active border and territorial issue puts us in a very difficult space. On the one hand, we want to have some sort of balance or some semblance of normalcy in our relationship with China, but at the same time, when it comes to political and strategic and security issues, we are not with China. We have serious differences, and therefore we want to partner with the US allies increasingly over the last few years. With Japan and Australia. I think India does face serious dilemma in how to pursue all of this. But I think India has come to the couple of different conclusions. One, we don't want to see an Asia that is dominated by one single power. So even when External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar talks about a non-hegemonic Asia without naming China, it is very clear that he's referring to China because nobody else has shown the tendencies towards being a hegemon. Second is a rules-based order, which is very, very important, which is again which China again plays a very little regard for in a sense. So I think in many of these ways, I think it is very clear that we are not with China on the same page. We want some semblance of normalcy. So, but at the same time, we do have serious difficulties. So the Indian foreign policy is confronted with serious dilemma in how to manage this relationship. But I think the reality is that despite the fact of strategy, despite the talk of strategic autonomy and independent foreign policy, I think what India does on the ground is what we need to go by. And there, I think India is making some smart choices to partner with US, Japan, Australia, France, and other European plum powers as well. So I think that's going to be the reality because Indo-Pacific theater is going to be the serious sort of a scene of action. And I think there, even if all of us come together without the US, it's still not enough to balance China.
My guest on the show this week is Dr. Raji Rajagopalan. She is the director of the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. Raji, this is a kind of a moving target of a story. Developments seem to be changing faster than we keep up with them. But thank you so much for sharing your time and insights with all of us and with our listeners.
Thank you so much, Milan, for having me.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review, helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff J. Pranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.